On a quiet, forgotten street, where the sun barely grazed the cracked sidewalks, Clara, a 10-year-old girl, crouched before a pile of trash. Her gaze, sharp and determined, moved from one object to another as her small hands sifted through what others had discarded as worthless. No one noticed the frail child carrying the weight of a crumbling world on her shoulders. Clara wasn't there out of curiosity or play. She was searching for hope, not for herself, but for her mother, who had been confined to a cold bed for weeks, battling an illness that seemed impossible to overcome. The acrid smell of garbage didn't bother her. To Clara, it was the least of her worries. Her tiny hands stumbled upon something. For a moment, she hesitated. It wasn't a treasure, it wasn't money, but it was unlike anything she had ever seen before. She clutched the object to her chest, feeling something she couldn't quite explain, a mixture of fear and faith. Little did she know, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Clara lived in what could only be called a house in the most literal sense. Bare brick walls supported a leaking roof, and the small space was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from a frayed cord. The smell of mildew mingled with that of expired medicine scattered on the table beside the bed where her mother, Angela, lay motionless. Angela had once been vibrant, full of stories about the days when she sang in small bars to make ends meet, but now her voice was barely a whisper. Clara looked at her mother with the same love as always, but now it was tinged with a new emotion, a silent anguish, a fear she didn't know how to name. She was acutely aware that the food was running out, the bills had gone unpaid for months, and no one in the neighborhood answered her pleas anymore. Everyone was too preoccupied with their own struggles. That morning, Clara had made up her mind to do something that could change their lives. When she left the house with an old sack slung over her shoulder, Angela tried to ask where she was going, but her voice failed her. Clara pressed her lips together and walked out without looking back. Her bare feet kicked up dust on the street as the faint morning sun cast light on barking dogs and the hurried steps of people heading to work. On her way, Clara remembered the stories her mother used to tell her about how trash sometimes hid treasures. People throw away things that can still shine, Clara. You just need the right eyes to see them. That phrase now echoed in her mind like a mantra. She knew that, with the right hands, anything could become something valuable enough to buy medicine, food, or maybe even a future. When she reached a vacant lot, Clara began searching carefully. Her small frame moved with the agility of someone who understood that every second mattered. She found crushed cans, bits of wire, and an old, broken picture frame. To anyone else, it was just trash, but to Clara, it was a glimmer of hope. Suddenly, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. When she pulled it out, she discovered a small, partially rusted but heavy box. Opening it, she found an assortment of unusual objects: old medals, a stopped watch, and a few black and white photographs. It wasn't just valuable. It seemed to hold a story that didn't belong to her. Clara's heart raced. What if it was important to someone? But before she could dwell on the thought, she closed the box and tucked it into her sack. She stood up and glanced around, trying to see if anyone was watching her. Everything was still, except for the distant sound of footsteps and voices. All she could think of was her mother's face, the labored breathing, the tired eyes silently pleading for just a little more time. Clara tightened her grip on the sack and started walking home, unaware that a quiet shadow was following her from a distance. The smell of mold was even stronger when Clara returned home. The worn wooden door creaked as she opened it, the sound echoing through the empty room. Angela was still in bed, but her face looked paler. Clara stopped at the bedroom doorway, clutching the sack with trembling hands. The broken clock on the wall marked a time that seemed to stand still in that house. Clara knew she couldn't waste another minute. "Mom, look what I found," she said, stepping closer to the bed and placing the rusted box beside her. Angela didn't respond. Her breathing was slow and irregular, as though each breath were a battle. Clara sat down beside her, hugging the box to her chest. She felt helpless, but refused to let it show. She carefully opened the box and took out the medals one by one. There was an inscription on them, something Clara couldn't decipher. The old watch gleamed faintly under the weak bulb, as if it still had something to offer despite being stopped. Clara put everything back into the box, but this time with a new determination. "I'm going to sell this, Mom. I'll get the money we need. You'll get better, I promise." What Clara didn't know was that her decision to seek help would change everything. When she left through the door again, gripping the box tightly, a watchful gaze followed her from a nearby window. It was the same man who had seen her at the vacant lot. His hands were dirty, his face etched with worry lines, but his eyes carried something more. Curiosity and an intention Clara could never foresee. Clara made her way to the small antique shop downtown. The entrance was narrow, and the shelves were packed with items that seemed as old as the stories they carried. The owner, an elderly man with foggy glasses, looked at the box with interest. "Where did you find this?" he asked in a low, steady voice. Clara hesitated. She knew those questions were always laced with suspicion. She decided to keep it simple. "Just found it. Can you buy it?" He examined the items, lingering on the medals and the watch. When he looked back at her, there was something strange in his expression, but he said nothing. He simply pulled out a few bills and handed them to her. "This should help. Take good care of your mother." Clara didn't know how he knew about her mother, but she took the money and ran back home. Relief washed over her, knowing she could now buy something to help Angela. But when she arrived, the door was ajar. Her hands froze on the doorknob. Clara dropped the box to the ground before stepping inside. The open door was a clear sign something was wrong. She took a deep breath and walked in slowly, a shiver running down her spine. The house felt darker than usual, and the silence was almost unbearable. In the bedroom, Angela was still lying down, but her expression looked more strained. Clara realized her mother hadn't moved since she left. "Mom, I got the money. We'll get the medicine," she said, trying to sound confident, but her voice quivered. Angela opened her eyes with effort and managed to whisper something Clara couldn't fully understand. The girl moved closer, holding her mother's hand, which felt colder than ever. "I'll be right back. I promise I'll be quick." Without wasting time, Clara grabbed the bill she had received and ran to the small neighborhood store. The shelves were nearly empty, and the shopkeeper, who had known her since she was a baby, looked at her with a mix of pity and surprise. "You're alone again? Where's your mother?" he asked. "She's at home. I need to buy medicine. Do you have anything for pain and fever?" Clara replied quickly, pulling the money from her pocket. The man hesitated before reaching for a small bottle and handing it to her. "This will help for now." But he didn't finish the sentence. Clara thanked him and left without looking back. She knew what he meant, that it wasn't enough, that Angela needed more than painkillers. But Clara didn't have time to dwell on what she couldn't do. On her way back, something felt off. She had the unsettling feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder a few times, but didn't see anyone. She quickened her pace, clutching the bottle as if it were the most precious thing in the world. When she reached home, she locked the door carefully and went straight to her mother's room. Angela looked even weaker, but a faint smile appeared when she saw her daughter. Clara opened the bottle, dissolved a pill in a spoonful of water, and helped her mother swallow it. "You're going to get better, Mom. I promise." Exhaustion finally caught up with her. Clara lay down next to her mother, holding her hand, and felt her eyes grow heavy. But just as she was about to drift off, she heard a noise outside. Someone was there. Clara woke with a start. The house was steeped in silence, but something in the air felt different. The morning light filtered through a crack in the window, casting a soft glow on Angela's tired face. Still clutching her mother's hand, Clara heard another noise, this time coming from the yard. It was muffled, like someone had bumped into something. Her heart raced. Slowly, she got up and walked to the front door. Peeking through the gap, she saw a man rummaging through a pile of boxes outside. He seemed to be searching for something. It was the same man she'd seen near the vacant lot days ago. He didn't look dangerous, but he didn't seem trustworthy either. Clara froze, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the man noticed her. His eyes, once scanning the boxes, locked onto Clara. His face was rough, weathered by time, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his expression. He stepped back, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "Hey, I just wanted to return this." "I think you dropped it yesterday," he said, holding up a small piece of cloth Clara had used to wrap the watch she'd sold. Clara stared at the man, unsure whether to believe him. She opened the door just enough to take the cloth. "Thank you." The man hesitated before speaking again. "My name's Richard. I work with recycling around here. I saw you at the lot the other day. What were you looking for?" Clara lowered her eyes, embarrassed. She didn't want to explain everything, but something in Richard's voice made her feel a bit more at ease. "My mom is sick. I needed to sell some things to buy medicine." Richard seemed to think for a moment. Then, he pulled something from his pocket, a twisted piece of metal that looked worthless. You know, sometimes what seems useless can be worth a lot if you know how to transform it. This, for example, could become a piece of art. Have you ever thought about doing something like that? Clara frowned, confused. Richard noticed her hesitation and offered a small smile. "If you want, I can show you how. You help me with what I collect, and I'll teach you how to make things people might want." Clara didn't know if she should trust him, but when she went back inside and saw her mother struggling to breathe, she realized she didn't have many options. She had to do something, and quickly. Deep down, a question began to form. Why was Richard so interested in helping her? At the makeshift workshop where Richard worked, Clara looked intently at every old tool and pile of materials that seemed like nothing more than scrap. Richard was hunched over a workbench, hammering a piece of metal with firm yet careful movements, as if he knew the hidden potential in every discarded item. Clara approached slowly, holding a broken picture frame she'd found. Is this good for anything?" she asked hesitantly. Richard glanced at the object and motioned for her to place it on the table. He picked up the frame, turning it over and examining every corner. "It sure is. With a bit of care, this could turn into something people would want again. It's all about how you see it." Clara tried to process that. To her, everything she'd collected so far had value only because it could be traded for money. But Richard saw things differently, and it puzzled her. He began working on the frame, explaining each step with patience until Clara mustered the courage to try for herself. As they worked side by side, Clara remembered the stories her mother used to tell about how small things could bring happiness. She felt something new as her hands manipulated the broken pieces. Not just effort, but a spark of pride. When she finished, the object in front of her no longer looked like trash. It was a new piece, simple but beautiful in its own way. "You've got a knack for this," Richard said with a slight smile. Clara didn't respond, but her heart clenched. She thought of Angela, her mother's tired expression, and felt the same heavy weight she always carried. She knew this wasn't enough. She needed to do more, much more. Richard noticed her silence and shifted his gaze away. He grabbed a chair, sat down, and began cleaning a golden piece. "You remind me of someone," he said after a while. Clara looked up, curious. "Who?" He didn't answer immediately, placing the piece aside and gazing out the workshop's open window. The setting sun bathed everything in shades of orange. Someone who also thought the world was too heavy to carry. Before Clara could ask more, Richard stood and returned to the workbench, changing the subject. "Tomorrow, bring whatever you find. Let's see what we can transform." Clara didn't press him. She knew there was more to his story, but something in Richard's expression made her let it go for now. She picked up the finished frame and left the workshop, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that maybe there was more to life than just surviving. When she got home, she found Angela asleep. The room was dark, but the sound of her mother's labored breathing reminded Clara that there wasn't time to waste. She placed the frame in a corner alongside the money she still had and sat by the bed. In the quiet of the night, she heard the sound again, coming from outside. This time, it didn't sound like just the wind. The next morning, Clara woke early. The room was still cloaked in shadow, but faint rays of sunlight seeped through the cracks in the window, illuminating her mother's face, which seemed even paler than the day before. Clara gently touched Angela's hand, now colder than ever. She took a deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of fear growing in her chest. She knew she needed to return to Richard's workshop, but something held her back. Leaving the house felt like abandoning her mother for too long. "I'll be back soon, Mom. I promise," she whispered, even though she knew Angela could barely hear her. Clara grabbed the old sack she used to carry the materials she found and stepped outside, the chilly morning air brushing against her face. She walked through the deserted streets, trying to ignore the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. When she arrived at the workshop, she found Richard already at work. "You came," he said without looking up. Clara placed the sack on the workbench and began emptying its contents. Pieces of wood, twisted wires, a broken bottle. She waited for a nod of approval, but Richard only examined the items carefully, saying nothing. "It's not much," Clara admitted, lowering her eyes. "It doesn't have to be much. It just has to be something worthwhile," he replied, pulling a piece of wire closer. The two worked in silence, transforming the materials into something Clara was starting to recognize as beautiful. But while her hands were busy, her mind was elsewhere. She thought about her mother, the money they still needed, and the time slipping through her fingers like sand. When Richard finally broke the silence, his voice was different, almost hesitant. "You can't carry it all by yourself, you know?" Clara froze, her hands still holding a piece of wood. She looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Richard lowered his gaze, fiddling with a piece of metal as if searching for the right words. "Sometimes, when we try to do everything alone, we forget there are people around who can help." Clara wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Part of her knew he was right, but the other part, the one that lived every day beside Angela, couldn't imagine who would actually care enough to help. Who else could she rely on but herself? Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps outside caught their attention. Richard stopped what he was doing, and Clara felt her body tense. A stranger appeared at the workshop door, carrying a heavy bag and wearing an expression that suggested he knew Richard. "We need to talk," the man said, ignoring Clara entirely. Richard exchanged a brief glance with her before walking to the door and partially closing it behind him. Clara was left alone in the workshop, straining to hear the muffled conversation outside. She knew she shouldn't interfere, but something about the stranger's posture and the tension in Richard's expression made her inch closer to the door. She caught only a few words, but they were enough to spark even more questions. "You can't keep running from this." Clara stepped back, her heart pounding. When Richard returned, his expression had shifted. He tried to smile, but the strain was evident. "Is everything okay?" Clara asked, unable to hide her concern. "Yeah, just an old acquaintance," he replied, avoiding her gaze. But Clara knew he wasn't telling her the whole truth. When Clara returned home that afternoon, Richard's words lingered in her mind. As she opened the front door, the silence inside the house felt heavier than ever. Then, from the bedroom, came a sound that made her heart stop for a moment, a faint, urgent whisper. She ran to the bedroom, her heart pounding so loudly it echoed in her ears. Inside, she found Angela trying to sit up, her face strained with effort. Her eyes locked onto Clara's, but her voice came out weak, almost a murmur. "Clara, I need you to promise me something." Clara knelt by the bed, taking her mother's hands, now more fragile than ever. Their coldness was unbearable, as though all the warmth was slowly slipping away. "Don't say that, Mom. I'm taking care of everything. I'll get more medicine, more food. You're going to be okay." Angela took a deep breath, summoning all her strength to speak. "It's not about me, sweetheart. It's about you. Don't let the weight of this stop you. Promise me." Clara bit her lip, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to say it wasn't fair, that she was just a child. But when she looked at her mother, she knew those words wouldn't help. "I promise," she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was interrupted by a knock at the door. Clara stood quickly, wiping her eyes. Who could it be? When she opened the door, Richard was standing there, holding something wrapped in a piece of cloth. "I made this for you. Thought it might help," he said. Clara unfolded the cloth carefully, revealing a small sculpture made from metal and wood. It wasn't just beautiful, it was unique. There was something about it that conveyed a message Clara couldn't quite put into words, but it moved her deeply. "I thought you could sell it," Richard continued, looking down at his feet. "Use the money to get what you need." Clara stared at him, surprised. "Why are you doing this for me?" Richard hesitated, as though searching for the answer within himself. Because someone did this for me once. And because you deserve a chance. Clara held the sculpture carefully, realizing for the first time that there might be more to Richard than he let on. But before she could ask more, he said goodbye, promising to return the next day. The air felt heavy as Clara closed the door after Richard left. The small house seemed quieter than ever, almost suffocating. Angela was still asleep, her chest rising and falling with effort, while Clara placed the small sculpture on the table beside the bed. At first glance, the object looked simple, but there was something about it that drew Clara's attention, as if it carried a story she couldn't yet understand. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, gazing at her mother. For a moment, exhaustion washed over her. Every day felt like a battle she always lost. The promise she had made to Angela echoed in her mind, but now felt unbearably heavy. "You need to rest, Clara." Her mother's words from weeks ago surfaced. Angela always said that when she saw her daughter pushing herself too hard. But how could Clara rest when everything depended on her? She stood and walked to the window. Night had fallen, and the streetlights flickered faintly. A dog barked in the distance, but it was the silence that bothered her most. Suddenly, she noticed something, a shadow darting quickly through the alley beside the house. Clara froze. It was the second time she had seen something like that. Moving cautiously, she opened the door and looked outside. The street was empty, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. She quickly closed the door and locked it, leaning her back against the wood as if it could protect her from whatever was out there. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Clara stayed by her mother's side, listening to Angela's irregular breathing while thinking about what Richard had said. "You can't carry it all by yourself." The words seemed simple, but each one felt like it was carving a path into her thoughts. When the sun finally rose, Clara was already up, determined to act. She grabbed the sculpture and the few savings she had left. Outside, Richard's workshop looked emptier than usual. She found him rummaging through a pile of old parts, but he stopped as soon as he saw her. "I want to sell this," Clara said, holding out the sculpture, "and I want you to help me make more." Richard raised his eyebrows in surprise, but then gave a small smile. "So, you finally get it?" Clara didn't respond. It wasn't about understanding. It was about necessity. She had no other choice. As Richard began to explain the next steps, Clara felt for the first time that there might be something deeper behind his help. But before she could ask, a voice interrupted. "What are you hiding, Richard?" They both turned at the same time to see the man from the previous day standing in the doorway of the workshop. His stance was threatening, and Clara instinctively stepped back. Richard looked uncomfortable but stood firm. "Clara, go home. I'll handle this." But Clara knew something was going on, something that could change everything. Clara felt rooted to the spot, unable to move. The man who had interrupted their conversation seemed to carry the weight of something unsaid, and the silence between him and Richard was unbearable. His eyes lingered on Clara for a moment, and she felt as though he was measuring her, trying to determine how much she knew or could find out. "You should go, girl," the man said, his voice dry but firm. Richard stepped in, his tone more urgent this time. "Clara, please go." "Now." Clara hesitated, but the intensity in Richard's gaze made her retreat. She grabbed the sculpture and walked away slowly, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor of the workshop. When she reached the street, the cold wind brushed her face, but it did little to dispel the sense of unease. Back home, the smell of the place felt stronger than usual. Clara placed the sculpture on the table and glanced at Angela, still sleeping deeply. The room was quiet, but the silence was oppressive, as though time itself had slowed down. She sat on the floor beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap, thinking about Richard, the man who seemed to know him so well, and the words that lingered in the air. "What are you hiding?" What could Richard be hiding? And why did that man seem so determined to uncover it? Clara stayed there, lost in thought, until Angela stirred slightly. "Clara," her mother called, her voice hoarse. Clara jumped up, taking her mother's hand. "I'm here, Mom." Angela took a deep, labored breath, her gaze more focused than before. "Are you all right?" Clara forced a smile, but the worry in her eyes was impossible to hide. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Angela tried to smile back, but soon closed her eyes again, too exhausted to continue speaking. Clara adjusted the blanket over her and sat in the corner of the room, watching her mother's every movement. A new urgency was growing within her. She couldn't wait passively anymore. She needed to act, to understand what was happening, and to protect the one person she had left. As the sun began to set, Clara heard footsteps outside. They were light but distinct. She moved cautiously to the door, her breath quickening. Peeking through the crack, she saw Richard standing on the sidewalk. He looked nervous, glancing up and down the street before stepping closer and knocking lightly on the door. Clara opened it just enough to see him. "What happened?" she asked bluntly. Richard sighed, rubbing his hand over his forehead. "We need to talk, but not here." The tone of his voice made Clara's heart race even faster. She glanced back inside at Angela, still sleeping, then returned her gaze to Richard. "About what?" Richard took a step back, as if searching for the right words. "About why I'm here, and why that man is too." The pounding on the door reverberated through the small house, shattering the silence with a force that made Clara jump. Angela remained asleep, her shallow breathing undisturbed, but Richard's tension was palpable, like a string about to snap. He turned to Clara, signaling for her to stay quiet. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low but resolute. Clara glanced at her mother, then at the open box on the table. Her heart raced, and though fear clawed at her chest, she nodded silently, unable to argue. Richard approached the door slowly, pressing his ear against the wood before speaking. "What do you want?" From the other side came a voice, cold and calculated. "You know what I want. Open the door, or I'll come in myself." Clara hugged herself tightly, trying to ward off the icy chill that seemed to seep into the house. Richard hesitated, glancing back at her as though searching for an answer that wouldn't involve opening the door. "We can't let him in," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard knew she was right, but he also knew the man outside wouldn't leave without a fight. The pounding intensified, followed by the voice again, sharper this time. "You have 10 seconds. After that, I break it down." Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if summoning courage. He returned to the table, slammed the box shut, and scanned the room for a hiding spot. Clara pointed to the space under Angela's bed, and he slid the box underneath without hesitation. Before he could step away, the sound of something heavy slamming against the door filled the air. The wood groaned under the pressure, and Clara felt her heart leap into her throat. Richard moved to the center of the room, raising his hands as though to defuse the situation. "Listen," he said loudly enough to be heard through the door. "You don't have to do this." But the splintering of wood was the only reply. The door gave way, and the man stepped inside like a shadow, his gaze locking onto Richard. Though slightly out of breath, his demeanor was unrelenting. "Where is it?" he demanded, his eyes sweeping the room. Clara shrank further into the corner, hoping to avoid detection, but she knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. Angela stirred faintly on the bed, her soft breathing drawing the intruder's attention. "Who else is here?" he asked, stepping toward the bedroom. "She has nothing to do with this," Richard shouted, positioning himself between the man and the bed. The intruder halted, narrowing his eyes. "Then tell me where it is." Richard hesitated, his expression a storm of conflict. For a fleeting moment, Clara saw that he was grappling with something deeper than fear. "It's gone," Richard said finally, his voice steady. "You'll never find it." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped closer, raising his hands in a mocking gesture. "Let's see about that." Clara knew she couldn't just sit and watch. Fear and anger swelled inside her, a volatile mix that pushed her to her feet. "Get out of here," she shouted, her voice startling both men. The intruder turned to her, his eyes darkening for a moment. But before he could speak, Angela coughed, a harsh, jarring sound that cut through the tension like a bell in a storm. All eyes shifted to the bed. For a second, the man's expression softened, a flicker of doubt or perhaps humanity crossing his face. Richard seized the moment. "Clara, run." She hesitated only for a heartbeat before diving under the bed to grab the box. Clutching it tightly, she bolted through the back door, the shouts and chaos fading behind her as she ran into the cold, dark night. The cold night air cut across Clara's face as she ran, her arms clutching the heavy box like her life depended on it. Her breath came in quick, ragged gasps, and her tears mixed with sweat, blurring her vision. The streets were nearly deserted, but every shadow seemed alive, every corner a potential trap. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to keep moving. Behind her, the darkness felt alive, as though the danger she fled was pursuing her with every step. Richard's urgent words echoed in her mind. "Run, Clara," and she ran, unsure of how far her legs would carry her. Turning a corner, she paused to catch her breath. She pressed herself against a cold wall, clutching the box tightly to her chest. The pounding of her heart seemed louder than the silence around her. Closing her eyes for a moment, she tried to push back the creeping fear. But a question lingered in her mind. Where could she go for help? Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the quiet street. Her eyes snapped open, her body freezing in place. She ducked behind a dumpster, holding the box as if she could vanish into the shadows. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged under the dim glow of a streetlight, the man. His sharp gaze scanned the street, searching. Clara held her breath, pressing herself as far back into the corner as possible, desperate not to make a sound. For a moment, he paused, his eyes locking onto the dumpster where Clara hid. Her stomach twisted, panic rising like a scream caught in her throat. But just as he began to move toward her, a distant noise shattered the tension. Siren wails. The man hesitated, glancing toward the sound. He muttered something under his breath before retreating, his steps fading into the opposite direction. Clara stayed hidden, waiting until the street fell silent again. Her legs shook as she stood, the cold biting deeper into her skin. Hugging the box tighter, she started walking. She needed to find safety, but every street looked unfamiliar, hostile. Her once familiar neighborhood now felt like a maze. Turning another corner, Clara spotted a small store still lit. A faint glow spilled out from the window of the market, where the owner, an elderly man she vaguely recognized, was locking up for the night. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she approached. The man looked at her with surprise, but didn't ask questions. He unlocked the door and let her in. "Are you all right? What happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Clara didn't respond immediately. She placed the box on the counter, then sat on the floor, the weight of her fear and exhaustion pressing down on her. "I need to protect this," she said, her eyes fixed on the box as if it were a ticking bomb. The man didn't press her further. Instead, he fetched a blanket and draped it over her shoulders, letting her catch her breath. For a fleeting moment, Clara felt the beginnings of safety. Then the screech of tires outside shattered the fragile calm. The sound made Clara's heart race anew. The tiny market, which moments ago felt like a refuge, now seemed too small, too exposed. The shopkeeper, who had been watching Clara with quiet worry, noticed the fear spreading across her face. "What's going on, child?" he asked in a low voice. Clara glanced at the door, then at the box in her lap. "Someone's after me. I need to hide this." Before he could respond, headlights flooded the store entrance, and the slam of a car door echoed outside. Clara ducked instinctively, crouching behind the counter. The shopkeeper moved to the window, peering outside with a frown, then turned to Clara. "Go to the storeroom. Quickly." Without hesitation, Clara grabbed the box and bolted to the back, weaving between narrow shelves stocked with dusty boxes and rice sacks. The musty smell of old goods filled the air, but Clara barely noticed. Her ears were tuned to the sound of footsteps approaching the store. At the front, the shopkeeper opened the door cautiously. Standing there was the man, his face a mask of anger and impatience. "I'm looking for a girl," he said sharply. "Small, brown hair, carrying something. Have you seen her?" The shopkeeper shook his head slowly. "No, haven't seen anyone." The man's eyes narrowed in suspicion. He stepped forward, peering past the counter and into the dimly lit store. "I know she came in here." In the back, Clara heard every word. Her hands trembled as she held the box, the weight of its unknown significance pressing harder than ever. She scanned the room desperately for a way out. A stack of old crates sat in the corner, and a locked door leading to an alley stood nearby. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The panic inside her grew as she heard the man insist, "I'll look for myself." His heavy footsteps echoed closer, and Clara knew her time was running out. She fumbled with the lock on the door, her fingers shaking too much to grip it properly. The man's shadow darkened the entrance to the storeroom. "Did you really think you could hide forever?" he said coldly. Clara stepped back, clutching the box tightly. "Stay away," she shouted, but her voice trembled. The man took another step forward, a smirk playing on his lips. But before he could get closer, a loud knock boomed from the front of the store. "Police, open up now." The man froze, his smirk fading into a scowl. He turned toward the sound, muttering curses under his breath. Seizing the distraction, Clara dropped the box just long enough to grab one of the crates. With all the strength she could muster, she hurled it at the man. The impact sent him stumbling into a shelf, which toppled over with a crash of falling boxes and bottles. "Over here," the shopkeeper called, appearing suddenly with a key in hand. He unlocked the back door swiftly and shoved it open. Clara snatched up the box and darted through the door into the freezing night. She didn't stop to look back, her breaths coming in sharp bursts as her feet pounded the pavement of the dark alley. Behind her, the chaos of voices and crashing sounds faded into the distance. The box remained secure in her arms, but Clara knew now, more than ever, that she couldn't keep running forever. The icy wind stung Clara's face as she ran, clutching the box to her chest as if it held the last thread of her existence. Her bare feet barely registered the rough ground, but the weight in her heart, fear, exhaustion, and a gnawing sense of doubt made each step feel heavier. Finally, she ducked into a dark corner between two abandoned buildings and crouched down, trying to catch her breath. She rested her forehead against the rough wooden box, its texture grounding her in the midst of her spiraling panic. Images flashed through her mind. Her mother's weary face and labored breaths, Richard's cryptic warnings, and the icy glare of the man who had pursued her. What was inside the box that made it so valuable? Clara knew she couldn't stay there for long. The darkness seemed alive, the shadows pulsing with unseen eyes. Resolute, she decided to open the box again, right there on the filthy ground. Her trembling hands lifted the lid, revealing the familiar contents: the medals, the broken watch, and the old photos. But this time, something new caught her eye. In the corner of the box, nearly invisible, was a hidden compartment. It blended seamlessly into the wood, as though designed to escape notice. The faint streetlight reflected off its edges, making the outline discernible. Clara fumbled with it, her fingers too weak to pry it open. She grabbed one of the medals, using it as a lever, and with a soft crack, the compartment yielded. Inside, she found a small, folded piece of paper. The material felt delicate, almost disintegrating in her hands as she unfolded it. When she spread it out, Clara saw what appeared to be a map. Lines and symbols crisscrossed its surface, but it was the small five-pointed star in the bottom corner that drew her attention. Its sharp, deliberate strokes seemed to hold a significance she couldn't yet grasp. Before she could process what she had found, the sound of footsteps jolted her back to the present. Quick, purposeful steps echoed in the alley. Clara hastily folded the map and stuffed it into her pocket, shutting the box as fast as she could. A shadow stretched across the alley entrance, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Clara?" The voice was familiar. It was Richard. He stood at the mouth of the alley, his face slick with sweat and his expression fraught with worry. "How did you find me?" Clara asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "It wasn't easy," Richard admitted, stepping closer but stopping when he saw her guarded stance. "But I had to. I needed to find you before he did." Clara's instinct screamed at her not to trust him. His words sounded sincere, but the intruder's chilling accusation echoed in her memory. "He's hiding something. What's in the box, Richard? Why does everyone want it?" she demanded, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. Richard sighed. running a hand over his face like a man about to unburden himself of a long-kept secret. "It's more than I told you before. Much more. Those medals, the photos, they belong to someone who uncovered things. Things about powerful people. Things they wanted buried." "What things?" Before Richard could answer, a loud noise shattered the moment. Clara's head snapped toward the other end of the alley, where the silhouette of the man emerged. And this time, he wasn't alone. "Run!" Richard barked, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her down the opposite side of the alley. The air felt suffocating as Clara and Richard tore through the labyrinth of dark streets, the looming shadows of buildings clawing at them. The footsteps behind them grew louder, relentless. Clara's chest heaved, her mind racing faster than her legs. "Where are we going?" she gasped. "To somewhere safe." "Trust me," Richard replied, glancing over his shoulder to assess their lead. Clara didn't trust him, not fully. But with the pursuers closing in and the box feeling like an anchor pulling her into an abyss, she had no other choice. Richard skidded to a halt in front of a rusted metal door, fumbling in his pocket before pulling out a small key. His hands shook as he jammed it into the lock and pushed the door open. "Quickly, get inside," he urged. Clara slipped in, hearing the metallic clang as Richard shut and locked the door behind them. The space was dim and cramped, shelves lined with dusty tools and clutter. It looked like an old storage room, but the oppressive silence inside offered a fleeting reprieve. Richard leaned against the door, panting. "They won't find us here for now." Clara placed the box on a nearby table, turning to Richard with a fierce glare. "Now tell me the truth. All of it. Why do they want this box so badly?" Richard hesitated, but Clara's unyielding gaze left no room for evasion. He rubbed his temples, piecing his thoughts together. That box belonged to someone who discovered dangerous secrets. Secrets about powerful people. They tried to erase everything, but that person left this as a key to something they've lost. Something they're desperate to get back. Clara pulled the map from her pocket, unfolding it carefully. "What is this, then? And why are you involved?" Richard stared at the map, his face darkening. "Because I was part of it," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I worked for them. I helped hide what this map leads to. And now, I'm trying to fix what I've done." Clara's chest tightened with anger and disbelief. "So why are you helping me?" "Because you shouldn't have to pay for something that isn't your fault," Richard said, his tone earnest. Before Clara could respond, the screech of metal filled the room. The door shook violently as someone on the other side tried to force it open. "They found us," Richard muttered, grabbing a metal bar from the floor. He turned to Clara, his expression grim but resolute. "Listen to me. Take the box and go through the back exit. There's a trail that leads away from here. Follow it until you're safe." "What about you?" "I'll hold them off." "No, I can't leave you." "Clara." Richard's voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed a sorrow she couldn't understand. "You have to go. Now." Reluctantly, Clara grabbed the box and ran to the back door. She paused, looking back to see Richard bracing himself with the metal bar, ready to face whatever came through the front. She slipped out into the night, the frigid air biting her skin once more. The trail ahead was dark, the trees forming a tunnel that seemed endless. The box felt heavier than ever, but Clara pushed forward, the sound of voices and struggle fading behind her. And then, silence. A silence that stretched into eternity, chilling her more than the wind ever could. The path back felt endless and heavier with every step. Clara walked beside Richard, who limped with visible cuts across his face but didn't utter a single complaint. The box was back in her arms, and the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet filled the silence. The night was still dark, but within Clara, a growing light of determination burned brighter than she thought possible. When they finally reached the house, Clara paused in front of the door. Richard stood beside her, his expression heavy with worry. "You've done something most adults wouldn't have the courage to do," he said quietly. Clara didn't reply. She simply took a deep breath and opened the door. The familiar scent of home greeted her, but the oppressive silence was what truly stood out. Angela was awake but pale, her tired eyes following Clara's movements as she entered the bedroom. "Mom," Clara whispered, kneeling by the bed and holding Angela's frail hand. Angela offered a faint smile. "Are you okay, my little one?" The words caught in Clara's throat. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. "I am, Mom, and you will be too. I promise." Angela tried to respond, but a weak cough cut her off. Clara rose quickly and set the box on the table, her hands steady despite the whirlwind inside her. Richard lingered in the doorway, watching silently. "What's your next move?" he asked. Clara opened the box once more, pulling out the map and spreading it across the table. The yellowed paper seemed incomplete, but Clara studied it as if she already knew what to do. "You said this leads to something important," she said, looking at Richard. "What is it?" Richard stepped closer, his movements cautious. "It's a place. A hidden spot where they stored evidence. Proof of things they didn't want anyone to find. Can it help my mom?" The question was simple, but it stopped Richard in his tracks. He hesitated before answering. "I don't know. But if they're willing to hurt you for this, then what's hidden there must be more valuable than money or medicine. It might be what you need to change everything." Clara's gaze dropped to the map again. The star in the lower corner seemed to call out to her, a compass pointing toward answers she didn't yet understand. "Then we're going to find it," she said firmly. Richard stared at her, surprised by her resolve, but unwilling to argue. He knew that Clara's determination was something no one could take from her. Across the room, Angela's weak voice broke the moment. "Clara, be careful." Clara squeezed her mother's hand tightly. "I will, Mom. I promise." Richard picked up the map and held it under the dim light of the lamp. "If we're going to do this, we need to leave now, before they come back." Clara glanced at her mother, then at Richard. She knew leaving Angela alone was a risk, but the urgency of the situation left no room for hesitation. With a heavy heart and fear weighing on her chest, Clara prepared to take another step into the unknown, a path that could hold the answers she desperately needed. When Clara stopped running, she found herself outside the old workshop. The box still weighed heavily in her arms, but the absence of Richard pressed even harder on her heart. He had stayed behind, risking everything so she could escape. She looked down at the box, then at the map. There was more inside than hidden secrets. There was a chance to save her mother, to finally change the impossible. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way to the only place she could think of for help, the small market. The shopkeeper, the man who had helped her the night before, was stocking shelves when she entered. He turned to her, immediately noticing the dirt and exhaustion etched across her face. "Are you all right, child?" he asked, his concern evident. Clara set the box on the counter, her hands trembling. "I need help." The man's eyes flicked to the box, then back to Clara's resolute expression. "What's in here?" Clara drew a deep breath and opened the box again. She pulled out the map and handed it to him. The shopkeeper examined it carefully, his brow furrowing. "It's a place where they hid something important. Richard said it might save my mom." The shopkeeper studied her face, seeing something in her eyes that silenced his questions. He folded the map and grabbed his car keys. "Let's go." Clara didn't question him. They climbed into his car, the hum of the engine filling the silence as they drove along an empty road. The night grew darker, but Clara's resolve stayed bright. They stopped at a clearing deep in the woods, a quiet place that felt both eerie and sacred. Clara got out, clutching the box, and looked around. "Is this it?" the shopkeeper asked. Clara nodded. They began to dig where the map indicated, their hands working tirelessly. After what felt like hours, their tools hit something hard. Beneath the earth was a small, locked chest. The shopkeeper pried it open with a screwdriver, revealing its contents. Old documents, photographs, and a tiny vial tucked into a corner, almost unnoticed. Clara reached for the vial, holding it up to the faint light. The faded label seemed to suggest it was a medicine of some kind. Her eyes filled with tears. "Can this help my mom?" she asked, her voice shaking. The shopkeeper examined it closely. "It might, but we need to get back now." They rushed back to the house. Angela was still lying in bed, her breathing shallow. When Clara entered the room with the vial in hand, Angela's tired eyes brightened slightly. "Mom, I brought something. You're going to get better." With the shopkeeper's help, Clara administered the medicine. Angela struggled to swallow, but within minutes, her breathing steadied. Clara clutched her mother's hand, tears streaming down her face as relief and hope finally broke through her fear. "You did it, my little one," Angela whispered, her voice faint but filled with love. Clara cried openly, letting all the emotions she had held back pour out. In the days that followed, as Angela's condition improved little by little, Clara made a decision. She carefully stored the documents and the map in a safe place, knowing they held more power than she could yet understand. But Clara also knew that simply hiding the truth wasn't enough. She would find someone who could uncover the secrets buried in that box, not just to protect her family, but to ensure that no one else would have to carry such a heavy burden. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt something more than fear and pain. Hope. Weeks turned into months, and Angela slowly regained a strength Clara had thought was lost forever. The small vial they found was only the beginning. It gave Angela the energy she needed to continue her treatment, and for Clara, it gave her something even more precious: time. Richard never returned, but Clara knew he had done his part. He had sacrificed himself so she could escape, so her mother could have a chance. Even though she never saw him again, she felt his presence somewhere, silently rooting for her, believing that the girl who once carried the weight of the world in her arms could find a way to transform it. The box, with all its secrets, was not forgotten. Clara knew she held something bigger than her own story, something that could change lives, perhaps even right the wrongs of others. But more than anything, Clara discovered that the most important thing wasn't what the box contained. It was what she carried inside herself. Clara realized that even the smallest actions can carry immense weight. That love and determination have a power that can overcome any obstacle. The world had tried to break her in every possible way, but each challenge only strengthened her resolve to fight for those she loved. She also learned that truth, no matter how difficult, is necessary. Keeping secrets feeds fear, but bringing them to light can spark change, no matter how painful the process. In the end, Clara found something many people spend their whole lives searching for: a purpose. It wasn't just about saving her mother. It was about preserving what is most precious in all of us: the courage to begin again, the strength to believe in the impossible, and the hope that even the most forgotten pieces of the world can shine if seen through the right eyes. And now, I want to ask you, what would you do to save the one you love most? Let me know in the comments below. Stay tuned for another heartwarming story.